Welcome to the edge of sleep, where thoughts blur and shadows tell stories. I'll guide you through a few tonight. Not loud, not fast, just unsettling. Close your eyes, relax, and listen. Story 1. The Man Beneath the Station. The train station at Linham Cross was no longer in use, though no one could say exactly when it had stopped running. Some said it had closed after the new highway was built, that the tracks had been deemed unsafe, or that a landslide had buried a section farther north. Others simply shrugged, as if it had always been this way. The building stood in a narrow valley, surrounded by low hills, tucked away behind crooked birch trees and overgrown brambles. Ivy had wrapped around the old signal tower, and the platform had cracked in places where roots pushed up from beneath. The timetables still hung in faded glass frames, the names of far-off towns long forgotten. No trains passed through anymore, but the tracks remained, rusted and quiet, slicing through the valley like a scar. The air always seemed heavier there, even on the warmest days. Fog clung to the ground, even when the sky was clear, and the birds never perched on the wires overhead. Leah Arryn had not meant to stay long. She had come to Lindum to settle her grandfather's affairs. A man she barely knew, who had lived alone most of his life in a cottage just a few miles from the old station. After his death, she inherited everything: his house, the land, and whatever had been left behind. She imagined a dusty old home, filled with moth-eaten furniture and forgotten photographs. She did not expect the station to be part of it. On her second day in the village, an elderly man at the post office mentioned it. He used to keep the place up, he said, his voice as thin as the letters he sorted. Used to sweep the platform once a week, polish the windows too, though no one ever saw him go inside. Leah looked up from the parcel she was filling out. The station? I thought it was abandoned. Oh, it is, he said, sealing a letter with a slow press of his fingers. But he kept a key. She walked there that evening. The road turned to gravel just beyond her grandfather's property, then narrowed into a shaded path that followed the old tracks. It had rained earlier, and the air was thick with the scent of wet earth and rust. Ferns brushed against her legs as she moved through the undergrowth, and the silence deepened the further she went. No wind stirred the trees. No insects hummed. The station emerged slowly from the fog, its peaked roof dark against the sky. The building was made of old brick, stained and mossy, but intact. A wooden bench sat just outside the entrance, partially buried beneath fallen leaves. The glass windows were dusty, but not broken. The sign above the door still read Lindham Cross in faded white letters. To her surprise, the door opened easily. Inside, the air was cool and dry. The walls were lined with benches. The ticket window shuttered with a thick wooden panel. An old clock hung crooked on the far wall, its hand stuck at 2:17. She walked slowly, the floorboards creaking beneath her boots. Everything was still. There was a narrow hallway behind the ticket counter, leading toward what must have been the station master's office. She hesitated before stepping inside. The room was sparse. A desk sat beneath a window, a rusted lamp leaning precariously against the wall. Stacks of papers lay undisturbed in neat piles. A coat hung on the back of the door, long and moth-eaten, the shape of it faintly human. But what caught her attention most was the trap-door in the floor. It was not hidden, just a square of dark wood with a recessed handle. She crouched and ran her fingers along its edge. Cold, she did not open it. Instead, she backed away and returned to the entrance hall, her footsteps quicker now. As she stepped outside, the fog had thickened again. The trees looked taller, the tracks darker. A shape moved in the corner of her vision, just beyond the end of the platform. She turned. No one was there. That night, she dreamt of the station, of footsteps below the floor, of a man standing in the fog, his coat too long, his face turned away, waiting, always waiting. When she woke, the sheets were cold, and the house smelled faintly of rust. The next morning, the mist outside had not lifted. It hung across the hills like a sheet of pale gauze, clinging to the hedgerows and fencing, thickest along the route that led down to the station. Leah stood at the kitchen window, holding a lukewarm cup of tea, watching the trees shift in the soft breeze. Somewhere in the distance, a bird called once, and then fell silent. The unease from the previous night hadn't faded. She'd woken more than once, convinced she'd heard movement on the old wooden floors of the cottage. But whenever she sat up, the silence returned, complete and absolute. There had been no footsteps, no shadows, just a creeping sense of attention, like someone watching through the windows, just beyond the reach of the curtains. She told herself it was the station. The trapdoor had unsettled her. It was just a trick of the light, the brain trying to fill in empty spaces with old fears. But the image stayed with her, the shape in the fog, the figure she hadn't really seen but could still remember. The long coat, the turned face. She finished her tea and, without quite deciding to, put on her coat and boots again. The walk back was slower this time. The fog had thickened, rolling along the ground in uneven waves. The path was slick with rain, the trees on either side drooping beneath the weight of moisture. The further she went, the quieter the world became. Even her footsteps sounded muffled, as though the fog swallowed every sound the moment it left. Her lips. When the station finally came into view, it felt older, not just in appearance, but in presence, like something that had sunk deeper into the earth overnight. She hesitated at the edge of the platform. The tracks stretched out to either side, vanishing into fog so thick it looked like smoke. Nothing moved. There were no sounds. The station sat still, as if waiting for her return. She stepped inside. The air was cooler than it should have been. Her breath fogged faintly as she moved through the entrance hall. Dust still coated the benches, the clock still frozen. She passed the shuttered ticket window and returned to the office at the back. The coat was still there. Its long, heavy shape hung motionless, the folds of the fabric resting unnaturally straight, as though the air had not stirred in years. She stood over the trap door again, and this time she opened it. It groaned softly, the hinges stiffed but not rusted. A faint smell rose from below, damp, earthen, and something else. Not rot exactly, but something old and stale, like air trapped in stone for too long. A narrow wooden staircase led down into the dark. She had not brought a flashlight. Her phone was nearly dead. Still, she took the first step. The wood held her weight, but it creaked underfoot. The light from the office faded with each descent, swallowed slowly by the narrow passage. After 10 steps, she could no longer see the door above. After 20, her hand touched stone on either side. The staircase ended in a small chamber. It was no larger than the station master's office, but made entirely of dark brick. The floor was hard-packed dirt. A single bench sat against the far wall, and directly across from the stairs stood a heavy iron door. It was shut. She stepped forward, cautiously. The air was still, but not empty. There was a sense of presence, as though the room remembered being used, remembered voices echoing off the walls. The iron door had no lock, no handle, just a round, rusted indentation at chest height, like a seal or emblem that had been worn smooth. She touched it. The cold shot up her arm like a current, a flash of pressure behind her eyes, and she heard it again, footsteps above. Then, a low hum, a sound so deep and low, it barely registered as noise. It vibrated in the bones of her chest, in her teeth, in the soles of her feet. She pulled her hand away quickly and backed toward the stairs, breath short. When she reached the top, the coat was gone. The office was empty, but the front door of the station stood open now, and fog had begun to pour inside. She ran, back, through the entrance hall, across the cracked platform, along the path, through the woods. The fog followed, thickening behind her, pressing against her back like a rising tide. She didn't stop until she reached the cottage, slammed the door, and locked it behind her. Inside, the air was still, cold, but not silent. There was a sound she could not place, a soft dragging, like cloth pulled across wood. Then, nothing. She stood in the doorway, listening for minutes that stretched long and thin. Eventually, the feeling passed. That night, she did not dream. She stared at the ceiling until her body gave out, and when sleep took her, it was dreamless and cold. But when she woke, she found footprints by the front door, bare, wet, too large to be hers, leading away from the house, back toward the trees. Leah stood at the edge of the porch, staring at the footprints. They began at the base of the steps and trailed off into the thick mist that pooled across the yard, vanishing where the tall grass overtook the gravel path. Each print was distinct, larger than her own foot, and marked by a wetness that hadn't come from any rain she could remember. The grass was dry to the touch, brittle even, but the prints shimmered as if something cold had stepped through the fog and left the ground, momentarily alive behind it. She didn't follow them, not that morning. Instead, she spent the day inside, pretending to organize boxes, half listening to old cassette tapes she found in a drawer, her attention drifting every time the floor creaked or the wind whispered against the windows. The cottage, once simply old and worn, now felt like it was holding its breath. The rooms were colder than they should have been, even with the radiators turned on. She layered herself in sweaters and scarves and tried not to look at the darkened corners of the hallway where the light didn't quite reach. By afternoon, she gave in. She went to the small local archive tucked inside the town's library, a converted chapel near the square. The woman at the desk looked half surprised too. See her, as if visitors were rare, and strangers rarer still. Leah explained that she was sorting through her grandfather's things, and asked if they had any records on Lindham Cross Station. The woman hesitated before answering. "That's the one out past the woods." Leah nodded. "Yes, it's been closed a while, right?" The woman gave a shallow shrug. "Decades, I suppose, officially. But even before that, no one much liked using it. Why?" She offered a careful smile. "Some places don't hold on to people well. There were disappearances. A few staff went missing. A boy once, during a school trip. They blamed the tunnels. Said he must have fallen. But his body was never found." Leah frowned. "Tunnels." The woman opened a dusty drawer, pulled out a set of folders, and laid one in front of her. There was a spur line that split off underground, used mostly for freight, back when the mines were still open. But those lines were sealed up. At least, that's what the company claimed. Inside the folder was a faded map. It showed the main station, and beneath it, branching out like the roots of a tree, was a network of tunnels, some labeled, some scratched out entirely. One of them was marked Sub-Level 3, decommissioned. "That iron door," Leah murmured. "Pardon." She closed the folder slowly. Never mind. That evening, she walked home with the folder tucked beneath her coat. The air had grown colder again, and frost had started to creep along the edges of leaves and stone. The trees were bare now, their branches black against the sky, and the fog returned just as she reached the cottage. The footprints were gone, but the door to the cellar was open. She hadn't touched it in weeks. It had been locked since she arrived, the key long lost. But now it stood slightly ajar, the metal handles slick with condensation, the darkness inside absolute. She paused, heart rising into her throat. Then, slowly, she pushed it shut and wedged a chair beneath the handle. That night, she lit every lamp in the house and curled beneath a thick blanket, map open in her lap. Her eyes traced the lines again and again, looking for patterns, looking for any explanation she could cling to. But the truth, cold and unwelcome, had begun to press against her in ways she couldn't ignore. Someone, or something, had come up from below. not just from the trapdoor, from deeper, from a place the map marked only with a thin red line and no name. At some point, her eyes closed, and the dream returned. She stood in the platform's waiting hall, but it was not ruined or dust-covered. It was whole, candlelit, filled with people who did not move. They sat with suitcases in their laps, hands folded, eyes closed, not asleep, not alive, waiting. Beyond the glass, a train approached, but it made no sound. Its windows were black, and behind it, the fog rolled in like water. She turned to run, but her feet were heavy, sinking into the floor. And from behind the ticket counter, a shape stepped forward. A man in a long coat. Not walking, gliding. His face was covered by something dark and wet, like cloth left too long in the earth. But she saw his eyes, pale, open-like, empty. He raised a hand slowly, as if offering her something. When she awoke, the map was gone, and the cellar door stood open again. The morning brought no sun. The fog had thickened to a colorless shroud that dulled every surface and muffled every sound. Leah stood in the kitchen, one hand on the back of a chair, staring at the open cellar door. The chair she had wedged beneath. The handle the night before now rested on its side against the floor. The door hung open like a mouth left ajar mid-breath. She could smell the air rising from the space below. Damp, old, touched faintly by rust. A faint draft drifted upward, carrying the scent of stone and stillness. The map, which she had fallen, asleep clutching, was nowhere to be found. She searched the living room, the bedroom, even the narrow space behind the radiator, where papers sometimes slipped, but nothing turned up. And yet, the image of the tunnels remained burned behind her eyes. She had memorized the layout without realizing it. The long central corridor, the branching paths, the red line that curved down and away from the station, ending in a mark with no label. It had felt deliberate, like a trail someone once tried to erase. By mid-afternoon, she resolved to return. The fog had not lifted, but it thinned slightly as she approached the tree line. Her boots pressed down over a layer of half-frozen soil, the trees standing like sentinels to either side. The wind whispered through the branches high above, and her breath came in short clouds as she followed the old track. The station emerged from the mist just as she remembered. Still, silent, forgotten by the world beyond the valley. But something about it had changed. There was a new scrape along the platform edge, like something heavy had been dragged toward the tracks. The door stood open again, as if it had been waiting for her. Inside, the air was colder than before. No footprints marked the dusty floor, but the coat was back, hanging precisely as it had the first time she entered the office. Still unmoving, still watching. The trapdoor was open. There were no doubts this time, no hesitation. She descended the staircase with the old flashlight she had dug from the back of a drawer, its beam flickering faintly with age, but steady enough. The walls pressed close. The stairs seemed longer. When she reached the bottom, the stone chamber welcomed her in silence, and the iron door was open. It hadn't swung ajar. It had receded, retracted inward into the wall, as if the stone itself had softened to allow passage. Beyond it, a tunnel stretched forward, framed in brick and lined with old iron rails. The flashlight illuminated only 20 feet ahead before darkness reclaimed the air. She stepped inside. The tunnel curved gently, and the deeper she went, the more time seemed to slow. Her footsteps echoed, but not in rhythm. The sound came back. Late, or not at all. Sometimes she heard more footsteps than she took, sometimes fewer. Water dripped steadily from cracks in the ceiling, forming narrow puddles along the path. The air thickened. The walls bore markings she did not recognize, scratched symbols, old numbers, some gouged deep, others faded beneath the passage of hands or time. After perhaps 10 minutes of walking, she reached the split. Just as it had appeared on the map, The tunnel diverged, one branch continuing straight, the other veering sharply left and descending. She turned, the air shifted. It grew warmer, not by temperature, but by feeling, like breath passed across the back of her neck. The walls became less regular, the brick replaced by rough-cut stone. As though the further one went, the less it had mattered how the path was shaped. Soon she reached the end of her light. Her flashlight sputtered, flickered, then steadied again. She stood at the edge of a wide chamber, the floor sunken and ringed with shallow steps. Along the far wall was a recess, and in it, something leaned. A figure, tall, thin, coated in dust and shadow. It stood facing the wall, head bowed, not moving, not breathing. Her heart rose in her throat. She lifted the flashlight slowly. The light touched its shoulder. The coat was familiar, long, faded, black moth-eaten. It was the same coat from the office door. The same coat that had vanished, and now it wore someone. She backed away slowly, the beam shaking in her hand, but the figure remained still. On the far side of the chamber, a second shape moved. A quiet glide, as if someone else had just entered, from another passage. Leah turned and ran. She did not scream. She did not cry. She ran until the tunnel became a blur of stone and sound, until the chamber at the foot of the station was beneath her again, the stairs ahead, the cold air of the office above calling her like the surface of deep water. She burst through the trapdoor and slammed it shut behind her. The office was unchanged, the coat gone once more. Outside, the platform had darkened unnaturally. The fog no longer looked like mist. It pressed against the windows like flesh, dense and pulsing. And somewhere in the distance, deep beneath the earth, a faint horn blew, the sound of a train long forgotten, moving, approaching, coming back. Leah stood frozen at the window, watching the fog coil and drift across the platform like a living thing. It no longer resembled mist. It pressed and moved with intent, rolling in thick pulses that seemed to align with the rhythm of her heartbeat. The sound of the horn, low, distant, and mournful, still echoed somewhere far below, as though it had traveled through layers of stone before reaching her ears. She turned from the window. The trapdoor at her feet was trembling slightly, a faint vibration that passed through the soles of her boots and into her legs. She stepped back from it slowly, breath tight in her chest. Her flashlight was still clenched in one hand, though the beam had grown weak, flickering along the edges. She wanted to leave, to step through the door and run back to the cottage, to the normal world waiting somewhere beyond the woods. But a deeper part of her knew it wouldn't matter. Whatever had stirred in the tunnels was not bound by the walls of the station. It had reached the surface now. She walked through the main hall in a daze, past the benches and the frozen clock. The second hand still pointing stubbornly at 17 minutes past 2. The door creaked open at her touch, and she stepped out onto the platform. The fog closed in around her. The tracks were no longer empty. Just beyond the edge of the platform, half submerged in the mist, stood the front of a train, silent, motionless, covered in soot and moss, as though it had been sitting there for decades. Its windows were opaque, darkened from within. No engine sound, no light, no heat. Yet something about it throbbed with energy, as though it had just arrived. She did not remember hearing it stop. She didn't remember hearing it start. But it had arrived. One of the doors stood open. She stood on the edge of the platform, staring at the opening. There was no conductor, no steps lowered to guide her in. Just the dark space beyond, a yawning invitation she felt tugging at the edges of her thoughts. A breeze passed behind her, and she turned quickly. Someone stood at the far end of the platform, tall, thin, still, wearing the coat. She couldn't see his face. It was obscured by the mist, but she knew it was him. The same presence from the dreams, from the tunnels, from the edge of memory. The man who was not a man, He raised one hand slowly and pointed to the train. No words, just the gesture, a direction. She backed away, one step, then two. The train groaned. The door began to close. And Leah understood, with a quiet certainty that chilled her to the core, that it had never come for anyone else. Not her grandfather, not the missing boy, not the station master, or the vanished travelers whose names had long been erased. It had come for her, and it would wait no longer. She turned and fled, through the trees, along the path, toward the cottage. But the path didn't bend where it should have. The woods were different, longer, denser. She ran until the ground felt soft beneath her boots, the air colder than it had ever been. Branches whipped at her coat, her face, her arms, and the fog thickened ahead until the trees vanished entirely, and she stepped into light. The platform again, same station, same mist, same door, now open once more. She had never left, her breath caught in her throat. The train loomed ahead, patient and quiet. The figure was gone now. The man in the coat had vanished, or perhaps he had never stood apart from the train at all. She stepped forward, one foot onto the metal step, then another. Inside, the car was lined with rows of empty seats, each coated in a fine layer of dust. It smelled of cold stone and paper, of oil and forgotten things. At the far end, a flickering light blinked from somewhere behind the glass partition. She moved toward it. As she passed the seats, she noticed details that made her stop. A scarf draped over one seat, a child's stuffed bear resting on another, an umbrella propped carefully against the wall. Personal things, left behind, or never retrieved. She reached the final row and turned. In the reflection of the glass, she did not see herself. She saw the man, standing where she stood, looking forward. She opened her mouth, but no sound came. The door behind her slid shut. The train began to move. It made no noise. It did not jolt or surge. It simply continued, forward, into the fog, out of the valley, beneath the earth, and away. Some say you can still see her cottage from the edge of the woods, though no lights shine inside anymore. The station, long since buried beneath moss and memory, is no longer marked on any map. But if you stand quietly on cold mornings, just before the sun rises, you might hear it, the sound of a horn deep beneath the soil, and the whisper of wheels on rusted rails, carrying those who remember, and those who have been remembered. Story 2. The silence below Mare Claritas, somewhere far from Earth. Drifting along the unlit rim of Mare Claritas, Station Ithaca turned quietly beneath the stars. It had been designed for endurance. Nothing elegant, just function wrapped in metal. A research outpost with 6 modules, a greenhouse, and a central corridor linking everything like a spine of glass and steel. The station's orbit traced a slow, deliberate path around Claritas, the smallest moon of a cold gas giant that had never been named by the public. It wasn't the sort of place that drew attention. It had no storms to admire, no rings to boast of, and only one moon, barely more than a large rock veiled in pale mineral dust. Claritas had no weather, no magnetosphere, no known seismic activity, just silence. And yet it drew the interest of scientists. It had hum, a persistent, low-frequency tremor, recorded by multiple flybys over several decades. Not loud, not even audible, unless amplified and filtered through layers of noise, but always there, steady and unfaltering, like something beneath the surface, was breathing in long intervals. So the station was built, and after many years of unmanned missions, they sent a person. Dr. Ellis Reyes arrived in the 3rd year of the station's operational life. There were no other crew members. The budget did not allow for rotation, and the psychological models had all approved her for long-term solo research. She was calm, intelligent, solitary by nature, and had passed the isolation simulations with scores that unnerved the evaluators. She had requested the assignment herself, and for the first 90 days, the silence suited her. She kept to a steady schedule, logging seismic readings, checking thermal fluctuations, mapping mineral compositions, with a kind of clinical detachment. The station responded well. Its systems were aged but reliable. The greenhouse provided oxygen, unlimited food variation, and the artificial gravity in the living module helped maintain her health. But it was always quiet. Even the hum, once filtered and analyzed, became part of the backdrop. She piped it into the speakers during sleep, letting the soft, low tone settle into her subconscious like a lullaby. She told herself it helped her rest more deeply, and perhaps it did, but she also began to dream in ways she had not expected. Not vivid dreams, at first. Just shapes, angles that did not resolve, colors that shimmered even after she woke, like afterimages behind her eyes. Occasionally, she would wake with the sense that someone had been speaking just a moment before, their words still retreating into the corners of her mind. On day 91, she saw the first footprint. It was in the airlock, a perfect outline, in the fine gray dust that always clung to the suits after excursions. She hadn't used the suit in 5 days, and the station's air filters kept the corridor clean. But the print was fresh, distinct, and human, slightly larger than her own foot, with a longer stride. She checked the logs. No breach, no pressure drops, no hole shifts. The cameras showed nothing unusual. She cleaned it away, but it returned the next morning. A second footprint, farther into the corridor, accompanied by a smear on the glass, where a hand might have brushed along the surface. She sat in silence for a long time, watching the handprint fade in the growing daylight, knowing the station's internal lights would adjust soon to simulate evening. Outside, the moon passed slowly beneath the hull, its soft mineral surface bathed in the distant shimmer of the gas giant's reflected light. There were no other ships in orbit, none scheduled. She checked twice. Still, she stayed calm. She documented the prints, photographed them, measured them, filed a report to command, though she knew it would take 12 hours to reach Earth, and another 12 to get a reply. Standard communications lag. In the meantime, she locked the airlock door and ran diagnostics on the life support systems. Nothing. That night, the hum sounded louder, not just in volume, but in proximity, as if the sound no longer came from beneath the moon's surface, but from the walls themselves, from the floor beneath her feet, from the bed where she lay. She turned down the volume on the playback system, only to find it had not been playing. The hum was not being piped in. It was inside the station. She did not sleep. Instead, she watched the corridor from her terminal, the feed looping gently in silence. Nothing moved. The print was gone again, or perhaps it had never been there. Her report to command remained marked as pending transmission. At 3:12, station time, the greenhouse lights flickered. Just once, barely enough to notice. And in that instant, she saw a shadow move behind the vines. There was no one there when she checked. Nothing disturbed. No change in oxygen levels. But as she stood in the warm humidity of the garden module, she became aware of something strange. The hum had stopped. For the first time since her arrival, it was completely silent. She hadn't realized how much she had come to depend on that sound, how much it filled the space between her thoughts, smoothing the edges of solitude. Without it, the station felt empty in a new way, not peaceful, not calm, vacant, and something in that vacancy watched her. She returned to her quarters, sat at the edge of her bunk, and stared at her reflection in the small mirror above the sink. Her face looked unchanged, a little pale, perhaps, but clear-eyed, steady, still herself. But behind her, in the faint reflection of the polished metal doorway, she thought she saw movement, just enough to break the symmetry. just enough to feel. Noticed, she did not turn around. Instead, she whispered aloud, not to anything, not expecting a reply. She simply asked, "Are you real?" The hum resumed. Not slowly, not gradually. It returned all at once, louder than before, resonating through the station with a deep certainty that made the panels vibrate and the lights dim for a moment. Then, silence again. Dr. Reyes sat alone in the dark, wondering if she had ever been alone at all. The next day passed in a blur of routines. Dr. Reyes performed her morning systems check, logged temperatures from the lunar surface, recalibrated the seismic sensors. The hum, that familiar background murmur she had once found soothing, had returned to normal volume, but it no longer felt passive. It had presence now, like the sound was aware of her listening. She kept her mind occupied with tasks, telling herself there was a rational explanation. Air pressure changes could cause strange acoustics. Dust in the ventilation system might carry sound in unfamiliar ways. And stress, particularly prolonged solitude, could mimic signs of outside presence. All of it could be explained. Still, she avoided the greenhouse. She made up an excuse in her logs. Something about condensation sensors needing a reset. But the truth was, she could not bear the idea of walking among the dense vines and oxygen-rich leaves. Not when she could still picture the shadow behind them. Not when her skin still crawled at the thought of being watched between the stems. Instead, she spent most of her hours in the main research module, bathed in the soft glow of monitors and the gentle rhythm of data streams. She reviewed old seismic readings, pulling samples from 2 weeks earlier. The hum had never been constant, in amplitude, but it had always followed a distinct rhythm, until recently. There was a new pattern now, a pulsing signal buried within the low frequencies. Not electrical interference, not internal system noise. It came from beneath the surface of the moon. The intervals were strange, not evenly spaced. Some were long, some short, forming clusters that looked almost like a sequence. A kind of language, perhaps, though that idea disturbed her more than it intrigued her. She copied the data and sent it back in a transmission packet to Earth. She attached a note. "Are these intervals natural? Seems patterned. Please advise." She left the file open on her monitor while she heated her meal pack, and when she returned, something was different. The file had been closed. That would not have surprised her. She might have clicked something by accident, or the system could have performed a brief power cycle. But what chilled her was the note she had left. It was still there, but the final 2 words had changed. It no longer read, "Please advise." Now it said, "Please arrive." She stared at the screen, heart beginning to race, and checked the terminal's history log. No changes recorded. No user inputs apart from her own. Yet the text was unmistakably altered. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, but she didn't type. She simply sat, watching the monitor as if expecting more letters to appear on their own. Nothing came. She forced herself to eat, though the food tasted like paste. She thought about checking the air filters again, wondering if something was being introduced into the atmosphere. Hallucinations, paranoia, the creeping sense of dissociation. It was all possible, but deep down, she didn't believe that. The station was functioning as it always had. The equipment was solid. The only thing that had changed was the moon, or what lay beneath it. By evening, she could no longer resist. She returned to the greenhouse. It greeted her with silence. The overhead lights dimmed to simulate twilight. The leaves of the engineered vine structures swayed slightly, stirred by the circulating fans. The humidity hugged her skin, softening the cold tension she carried in her chest. Nothing had changed, but she noticed a smell. It wasn't strong, barely there, but it didn't belong. Not rot, not mildew, not ozone. It was something more subtle, something ancient, like the air beneath old stone, or the scent of parchment long sealed in a tomb. She traced the rows slowly, flashlight in hand, though the lights overhead were still working. She was halfway through the second row when she saw it. A single leaf had been marked, not torn, not damaged by pests. Marked, a shape was burned lightly into the surface, too precise to be random. A shallow ring, with 3 spokes reaching inward, like a wheel or an eye. The edge was browned, edges curled slightly, a heat mark. She reached out to touch it, but hesitated. Her breath fogged slightly in the air, though it wasn't cold. And then her flashlight flickered. She spun, half expecting someone behind her, but the room remained empty. Still, she could not shake the feeling that something had moved, not seen, not heard, but displaced. Like a thought leaving her mind before she could remember thinking it. She backed away from the leaf, then turned and walked quickly out of the greenhouse. She sealed the module door behind her and keyed in a manual lock override, a procedure normally reserved for emergencies. Her fingers shook slightly as she entered the code. The hum shifted again that night. It came in pulses now, irregular and sharp. The sound vibrated through the floor beneath her bed, like something knocking softly from far below, a rhythm without urgency, but persistent. She lay awake, staring at the low ceiling, her thoughts tumbling in patterns she could not unravel. She tried to imagine what lay miles beneath the surface of Clarita's stone. Ice, nothing more. That was the consensus. But the dreams told her otherwise. That night, they changed. No longer just colors or shapes. She saw corridors, long, angular, lined with walls that shimmered slightly, as if coated in something that shifted between solid and fluid. The air was thick, too heavy to breathe, and a sound pulsed behind it all, a rhythm that matched the hum. She was walking toward a door in that dream, not a hatch, not human-made, something taller, broader, shaped not by tools, but by intention. It was shut, but she felt, in the marrow of her bones, that it was listening. She awoke, gasping, not from fear, but from the sudden realization that in the dream, she had not been alone. Someone had been walking beside her, matching her pace, and when she turned to look, she had seen no face, only the shape of a person, formed from the darkness itself, watching her, calmly, as if it had been waiting a long, long time. In the sterile blue light of morning, Dr. Reyes moved through the station like a ghost of herself. She hadn't spoken aloud in days. There was no one to speak to, but even the small reassurances she used to murmur during equipment checks had faded from her lips. The hum had grown more erratic overnight, fluctuating in volume and pitch without warning. Sometimes dipping into tones so low, they rattled the dishes in the galley cabinets. But it wasn't the sound itself that unnerved her anymore. It was the silences between. Every few hours, the hum would cease for exactly 8 seconds. Not more, not less, always 8. And in those moments, the station felt weightless in the wrong way, as though something fundamental had stopped functioning. The first time it happened, she had dismissed it as coincidence, a sensor lag, maybe. The third time, she timed it precisely. Now she anticipated it. It would start again in 12 minutes. She found herself adjusting her tasks to avoid being in the corridor when it happened. She didn't want to be in the hallway when the silence came. The last time she had been there, during the break in the hum, she thought she heard breathing from the walls. Slow, ragged breathing, almost like her own, but heavier. Wet. She kept the door to the greenhouse sealed, and no longer checked the markings on the leaves. But the symbols had begun appearing elsewhere. A ring, sometimes scratched lightly into the condensation on her bunk's window. Once traced faintly in the dust near the base of the navigation module. She stopped cleaning them off. She simply logged them and moved on. In the evenings, she sat by the communications panel and stared at the blank screen. Her message backlog showed as transmitted, but no responses had arrived from Earth. Not in over 48 hours. She sent a test ping. It returned, but slower than usual, as if the signal had been diverted. That night, she heard footsteps on the outer hall, not vibrations. Not the usual metallic creaks of expanding thermal panels or automated calibrations. She knew those sounds. This was different. Measured steps, one after another, circling the station slowly from outside. The exterior cameras showed nothing, but the sound continued, audible even without the microphone feed. Her hands trembled as she gripped the edge of the console. No one could survive out there without a suit. No one could move so smoothly in near zero gravity across the hull, and there had been no scheduled missions for weeks. No vessels in orbit, no way in or out without triggering the automated alert systems. And yet the steps continued. Long after she stopped checking the screen, she slept for an hour, maybe two, fitful, shallow sleep that left her more exhausted than before. The dreams had changed again. She was in a room she had never seen before, though it felt familiar. Octagonal walls, seamless. The same low, underwater-like gravity she had felt in earlier dreams. This time, she was not moving. She was standing still, and across from her was a figure. Not exactly human. It was shaped like a person, but its limbs were too long, its shoulders slightly sunken, like it had been stretched across a frame too large for its purpose. It did not approach, it simply watched, its eyes, not glowing, not reflective, simply present, met hers, and held her gaze with a stillness so absolute it felt like the moment had been suspended in time. She woke up with her mouth open, mid-breath, like she had been speaking before she regained consciousness. The comms panel blinked. One new message. She scrambled to the terminal, opened the file, but it was corrupted. A sequence of letters repeating, endlessly, not in a language she recognized. It took her 10 minutes to realize the pattern. Every eighth character was a space. When she filtered those spaces out and placed the characters together, the screen slowly filled with a single sentence, repeated again and again. "It's almost time." She stared at it for a long time, unable to look away. The hum pulsed once, louder than before, and the lights dimmed for a moment. When they returned, her reflection in the console screen looked off. The lighting was the same, her face was the same, but her reflection wasn't blinking. She turned her head slightly. The reflection remained still. She backed away from the screen, heart thudding. The reflection did not move. Then the screen flickered, and the image changed to a live view of the greenhouse. The door was open. The lights inside blinked in a slow, pulsing rhythm, and something, part shadow, part shape, moved through the vines, too tall to be human, too fluid to be mechanical. She sealed the command module's door and disabled all interior access. She knew it was already inside. The question was no longer if something had come. The question was whether it had always been there, waiting, listening, teaching her its rhythm, and guiding her, gently, to remember something she had never known. In the following hours, she heard no more footsteps, no voices, no changes in temperature, only the hum, and the faint sound of something breathing, not outside, not behind the walls, but somewhere closer, inside the station, inside her thoughts, waiting for her to accept that she was no longer alone. The fourth silence came while Dr. Reyes was brushing her teeth. 8 seconds of stillness, the same as before. Yet this time, the quiet arrived like the closing of a door behind her. Final, thick, and wrong. She froze in place, toothbrush suspended, mid-air. In that silence, she didn't hear footsteps. She didn't hear breathing. What she heard instead was something deeper, a vibration, barely detectable, like a chord strummed on a string so vast it could never fully resolve. It thrummed inside her molars, inside her ribs, as if the station itself was becoming part of the hum. When it ended, she lowered her hand slowly, her mouth dry with mint and fear. She rinsed, spat, dried her face, and stared at herself in the mirror. This time, her reflection blinked back. But it didn't bring comfort. She found herself studying the features, searching for signs of subtle change. A difference in the angle of the jaw, or the lines beneath the eyes. Something foreign, hiding in the familiar. Everything looked the same, yet she couldn't help but feel that it wasn't her looking back anymore. She left the bathroom and moved down the corridor to the research terminal. The dream from the night before lingered with her. Not the visuals. That room of impossible. Angles had become almost mundane now, but the sound, the voice, it hadn't spoken in any known language. It didn't even use words, but the intention had been clear. A question had been asked of her, or perhaps an offer, and though she had no memory of agreeing, she knew, with growing certainty, that she had said yes. At 9 o'clock station time, a soft tone sounded from the comms terminal. Not an alert, not a signal ping. It was the arrival chime, a notification used when someone was docking. Her stomach dropped. She pulled up the external feed. Nothing. No vessel. No movement. No heat signatures. The black void beyond the glass was as still as ever. The stars unmoving. The gas giant looming in its usual position, like a slumbering eye. She switched to internal diagnostics. The airlock reported no changes in pressure, no activity, but the log had updated. Access. Confirmed user. Null. She closed the terminal slowly, not bothering to log the anomaly. The entries no longer mattered. The station no longer responded to her commands in the same way. Lights that once hummed on with a button press now flickered unpredictably. Doors that should have remained locked occasionally drifted open of their own accord, only to be sealed again when she turned her back. In the greenhouse, the markings on the leaves had multiplied. Not just the ring now, but branching lines, intersecting loops, glyphs with an internal symmetry that hurt to look at for too long. Some had appeared in the moisture on the walls. Others had burned faintly into the polymer panels of the floor. She hadn't stepped inside in 2 days. But the door stood ajar now, despite the manual override, and beneath the gap, she could see the faint flicker of pulsing light, like a heartbeat or a beacon. She spent the rest of the day in the observation module. It was the one part of the station she still trusted, a domed space, half encased in transparent alloy, facing claritas below. The moon was still, pale, cratered, beautiful in its desolation, and far more alive than anyone on Earth suspected. She sat there for hours, watching it turn. At some point, she fell asleep. When she awoke, it was night cycle. The interior lights had dimmed, and only the ambient glow from the moon lit the room. For a moment, she believed she was still alone, until she looked to her left. Something stood in the doorway, not moving, not breathing, not casting a shadow. She didn't scream. She didn't move. She just sat there, breathing slowly, heart hammering in her ears. The figure was tall, its outline almost indistinct from the darkness around it. It had the proportions of a human, but with a posture too still, too exact, like a sculpture that had never been carved but had grown into that shape over time. She blinked once, and it was gone. She remained seated for a long while. Eventually, she rose and walked, not back to her bunk, but toward the core systems module. She didn't know what she was looking for, but she felt compelled, as though something had been guiding her steps all along. Down the corridor, past the research lab, through the sealed inner hatch, to a panel she had never opened before, a maintenance port, waist height, marked for diagnostics only. But inside, someone had scrawled a message into the metal, with fingernails, or something sharper. The key is within the silence. She read it once, then again, and then the hum stopped. Not for 8 seconds. It did not return. For the first time in 127 days, the station was truly silent. The lights overhead dimmed in unison, not flickering, not failing, just growing fainter, as though the station itself was withdrawing, pulling back, making space. She stood, listening, and in the silence, she heard her own breathing, and another, slower, deeper breath behind it. She turned around. The corridor was empty, but something had changed. She could feel it in the air. A presence, not malicious, not aggressive, but vast. Older than the stone beneath Claritas, older than the orbiting station, waiting. She felt something press gently against her thoughts, a suggestion rather than a voice, an invitation, and for the first time she understood the question the dreams had been asking. Not, what are you? But rather, are you ready? She didn't answer. She didn't need to, because she knew she had already said yes, long ago. She didn't sleep that night. She sat in the observation dome, staring out over the surface of Claritas, arms wrapped around her knees, eyes fixed on the pale, featureless rock below. The silence in the station was total now. No hum, no clicks from the climate systems, no quiet hissing from the oxygen recyclers. It was as though the station itself had gone still in anticipation. Outside, Claritas spun slowly in the gas giant's reflected light, casting long shadows over its cratered surface. The silence made it feel closer, as if the moon were just beyond the glass. Dr. Reyes found her thoughts were no longer entirely her own. They moved strangely now, slower, deeper, like a voice was thinking along with her, offering suggestions that arrived half-formed, but familiar. It wasn't a language she heard, not words, just understanding, passed between them like shared breath. She tried speaking aloud once, just to ground herself, just to prove she still had a voice. I'm still me. The sound startled her. It echoed too loudly in the chamber, like a violation. But even as she said it, she wasn't entirely sure it was true anymore. There were gaps in her memory now. Not entire days, but pieces of conversations she didn't remember having. Lines in her logs she didn't remember typing. Small things, enough to erode certainty. She no longer questioned the markings appearing on the walls. They were part of the station now, like veins beneath the skin of something alive. They pulsed faintly when she walked past them, and she understood that they were showing her the way. She stopped checking her messages. The last few had been blank, or worse, looped. Copies of her own transmissions, repeated back to her without time. Earth was no longer reaching her. Or maybe she was no longer within reach. The station had drifted. She checked the orbital parameters twice, then 3 times. The readings were impossible. They indicated that Station Ithaca had altered its trajectory, dropping lower toward Claritas by several kilometers. There had been no engine burn, no correction maneuver. The station had simply shifted. She brought up the last active map of the surface, and saw it. A dark patch on the southern edge of the Claritas Basin. Circular. Perfect. No crater. No geological explanation. Not a shadow. A structure. It hadn't been there before. She pulled up archived imagery. Cross-checked surveys. Nothing. And yet it was there now. Large enough to be visible from orbit. Smooth-edged. Silent. Waiting. She stared at it for a long time, then rose from her seat. She didn't pack a kit. Didn't suit up. She didn't need to. The suit was already waiting for her in the airlock, clean and polished. The helmet's inner screen blinked faintly, displaying a symbol she had seen carved into the walls just that morning, a ring with a vertical line through the center. She placed her hand on the visor. It recognized her touch. The lock disengaged with a soft hiss. She put on the suit slowly, methodically, each motion smooth, rehearsed, as if she had done this hundreds of times before, though this would be her first descent. She stepped into the airlock. The doors cycled open, and then she was walking across the lunar surface. There was no fear, no sense of danger, The ground beneath her felt soft, almost pliant, like it yielded slightly to her steps, guiding rather than resisting. Claritas stretched in all directions, empty and pale, the stars a curtain overhead. The gas giant loomed beyond, its mass turning slowly, casting faint ribbons of aurora through the moon's skies as silence. She reached the structure within the hour. It was far larger than she had imagined. From orbit, it had looked small, manageable. Up close, it was vast. A dome, smooth and seamless, carved from a material she couldn't identify. It reflected no light, but seemed to drink it instead. There was no door, no obvious entrance. But as she stepped closer, a section of the wall began to change. It shimmered, then parted, not sliding or swinging, but folding away in a manner that defied her understanding of geometry. The passage opened inward, revealing a corridor lined in the same dark material. Dim lights traced along the ceiling, if it could be called that, though there were no fixtures. Just a glow, pulsing in, slow synchrony with her heartbeat. She entered. The hum returned, not in her ears, in her mind. It was clearer now. A voice made of vibration and gravity, of memory and stillness. Not separate from her, not outside. It had been part of her all along, buried, forgotten. The corridor narrowed and turned. She followed without hesitation. At the end, she entered a chamber. It was circular, vast, the ceiling lost in shadow. At the center stood a pillar. Floating just above it, suspended by no visible means, was something small and shimmering, like a crystal or a key. She stepped forward and reached for it. The moment her fingers brushed its surface, the silence returned. Not absence, stillness, the kind that exists before thought, before light, before movement. A return to something primal, something sacred. She saw Earth then, not with her eyes, but with something deeper. Saw herself years ago, at her university lab. Her mother's face. The pages of an old childhood book she hadn't thought of in decades. And then, all of it faded, replaced by the understanding of what she had become. Not a visitor, not a scientist, but a vessel. The hum filled her now, not as sound, as purpose. She opened her eyes, or thought she did, and she was no longer on the surface of Claritas. She was within it. The station no longer existed. Time no longer existed. Only the rhythm remained. Slow, steady, eternal. Above, in orbit, where Station Ithaca once drifted, there was now only silence. And if you listen, far beyond the reach of transmission arrays, you might still detect the faintest pulse from beneath Claritas, a rhythm older than life, patient, persistent, welcoming the next to hear its call. Story 3, Where the Weeds Grow Lanterns. The estate was old enough that no one living could recall who built it. Nestled in the hills far east of town, beyond the paved roads and past the last of the wheat fields, it lay in a shallow bowl of land, surrounded by tall reeds and tangles of silver grass. Locals called it the Lantern Garden, not because of any lights that were visible from the road, but because those who trespassed often came back with strange stories. Glimpses of soft orbs glowing between tree trunks, flickers of flame that floated just above the moss, never casting shadows, never swaying with the wind. Those who spoke of it too plainly often fell quiet afterward. No one lived there anymore. At least, that was the understanding. But Elia Greer had a letter that suggested otherwise. It had arrived unexpectedly, printed in spidery type on thick parchment. No signature. Just her name, her address, and a short line. The house needs a caretaker again. You are next. She nearly threw it away. But the name of the estate, Ashmere House, was one she had not heard since she was a child. Her grandmother used to tell stories about it, back when Elia was small enough to believe that places had personalities. That some houses watched, and some waited. Her grandmother claimed to have worked there once, many years ago, tending the grounds and pruning the hedges that twisted like ropes along the stone walls. She spoke of the lantern garden in hushed tones, as if it were a place that remembered who had entered and who had not left quite the same. And now, decades later, here Elia was, walking the gravel path that led through a wide iron gate into the overgrown estate. She told herself it was for the quiet. After the last year, the end of a long relationship, the loss of a job that had once felt like a career, silence was exactly what she needed. A few weeks of rest, no obligations, a place to disappear. The house had been offered in full, no rent, no paperwork, just a single brass key and the instructions to enter through the garden gate at dusk. She arrived with a single suitcase and no expectations. The garden was much larger than she'd anticipated. It stretched far beyond the house, a wild tangle of trees, crooked walking paths, and stone lanterns grown thick with moss. They were the only things that had not surrendered entirely to the creeping ivy and root-thick soil. Dozens of them, spaced in quiet, thoughtful clusters throughout the greenery, like guests frozen in the middle of conversation. As she passed through the gate, the evening light made the world look like it had been dusted in ash. The sky was pale blue, sinking toward gray, and the soft wind carried a smell she couldn't place. Damp earth, flowers long since gone to seed, and something faintly metallic. Not unpleasant, but unsettling in its unfamiliarity. The house stood at the heart of it all. Ashmere was a sprawling structure of gray stone and timber, with arching eaves and tall windows that reflected the garden like a mirror. Vines climbed the sides like veins. The front door was set back in a small alcove, framed by two broken pillars. The key turned easily in the lock. Inside, the air was cool and still. Dust clung to the corners, but not as thickly as she'd expected. The furniture was covered in pale sheets, all but one chair near the window, which faced the garden and held a small wooden box on the sill. The floor creaked beneath her boots as she walked, and the ceiling was high enough that her voice echoed faintly when she murmured hello to no one. There was no power, but a few oil lamps had been set out, each one trimmed and filled, waiting. She lit one. Its glow was warm and heavy, casting long shadows that danced against the walls. She wandered from room to room, the sense of stillness growing as the night deepened. The upstairs hall had 12 doors, all painted in muted colors. Only one was unlocked. She chose it without hesitation. The room inside was simple. A bed with a heavy frame, a dresser that smelled of old cedar, and a mirror that had warped slightly with age. She placed her suitcase on the floor and sat on the edge of the mattress, listening. Not to anything specific, just to the way the house breathed. She hadn't expected to sleep well, but she did. Deep, uninterrupted sleep, without dream or restlessness. When she woke, the window was open, though she didn't remember leaving it that way, and there were footprints on the rug, not hers, bare, small. She knelt, touched one, dry, unmoved by the breeze. She closed the window and said nothing. That morning, she explored the garden. Paths curved in odd ways, turning sharply around trees that seemed to lean toward one another. In secret conference, the lanterns were everywhere. Some were cracked, their insides empty. Others were whole, their surfaces etched with fine symbols that looked more like organic growth than carved design. She didn't touch them. Birdsong was absent. No bees, no insects buzzing near her ears. Just the whisper of leaves. In the northern corner of the garden, past a pond choked with reeds, she found something stranger. A small clearing ringed with 11 lanterns, each one lit. She hadn't lit them. Their flames didn't flicker. They stood around a stone platform, barely raised above the soil, and in the center was a shape covered by a sheet of thin, pale cloth. She stepped closer. The fabric rippled slightly in the windless air, as if stirred from beneath. She turned away. Back in the house, the wooden box by the window had been opened. Inside was a collection of small notes, all written in the same tight, looping hand. She pulled one out. It read, "Do not let the lanterns go out." Another, "Do not speak to the one behind the ivy." And a third, "You are not the first, but you might be the last." She returned the notes carefully, closed the lid, and sat by the window as evening returned. From the garden, the lights flickered, but not with wind, with movement. And somewhere, far beyond the trees, a soft voice whispered her name. The second morning, Alaya awoke to the sound of tapping, light and deliberate, like fingernails against glass. She sat up slowly, unsure if the noise had come from her dream or from just outside the window. The sun was still low, rising behind, a curtain of mist that clung to the garden's edges like frost. The tapping stopped as soon as she stood. She pulled the curtains aside, but the glass showed nothing unusual, only the quiet sway of tall grass, and beyond it, the unmoving stone lanterns watching in their circular vigil. Still, the feeling stayed with her, the sense of being observed. She descended the creaking stairs with the oil lamp still lit from the night before. The scent of burned wick lingered in the air, mingling with something faintly floral that hadn't been present the day before. It reminded her of jasmine tea, though she hadn't found any such thing in the pantry. She boiled water and drank it plain, staring at the box on the windowsill. She didn't want to read the notes again, but the memory of them itched in the back of her mind. She opened the box anyway. The notes had changed. At least, they were not in the same order. A new one sat on top. "She is awake now." There was no name, no signature, just that single line. She replaced the notes slowly and left the house with her lamp. The garden waited, thick with dew. The stone path felt slick under her boots as she retraced her steps to the northern clearing. The 11 lanterns were still lit. The cloth-covered shape in the center remained undisturbed, though the pale sheet looked heavier now, as if it had drawn moisture from the ground or gathered something else entirely. She didn't approach. Instead, she turned to the eastern edge of the garden, where she had not yet explored. There, between twisted birches and a leaning iron fence, she discovered what must have once been a gardener's shed. The door opened reluctantly. Inside, the space was narrow and cool, the shelves lined with old tools, their handles worn smooth by long-forgotten hands. A ledger sat open on the workbench, its pages filled with meticulous notes about pruning cycles and seasonal changes. The last entry was dated 54 years ago. Alaya ran her hand over the page. The ink hadn't faded. In fact, it looked almost fresh. She closed the book, and something near the far wall caught her attention. A small lattice window, half covered, in ivy from the outside. She pushed the foliage gently back and looked through. There was another garden beyond, smaller, enclosed. At its center stood a woman. She was facing away, her long gray dress flowing in the still air as though caught in a slow current. Her hair, pale and unbound, reached to the middle of her back, and she stood so perfectly still that for a moment Alaya thought she might be a statue. Then the woman turned, not all the way, just her head, slowly, deliberately. Alaya jerked back. From the window, the ivy rustled as if in warning, and when she looked again, the garden was empty. Only the grass swayed. No sign of the figure, no footprints in the dirt. She left the shed quickly, glancing behind her twice as she followed the path back to the house. By the time she returned to the main entrance, the lamp in her hand had gone out. That evening, she lit it again and set it on the windowsill beside the wooden box. The lanterns in the garden still burned, visible now from her room. If she leaned at the right angle, she did not visit the clearing again that day. Instead, she watched the shadows stretch across the walls, noting how they shifted even when the lamp's flame remained steady. Just before sleep, she checked the notes again. They had changed once more. Do not follow her when she walks. Another, folded underneath. And if she knocks, do not answer. She lay in bed with the lamp on. The house groaned occasionally, as old buildings do, but there was another sound beneath it. A slow, rhythmic brushing, as if someone were dragging their fingers gently along the outer walls. When it stopped, the silence became worse, and then came the knock. 3 soft raps, barely audible. Not at her bedroom door, at the front of the house. She remained frozen under the blanket, her breath caught in her throat. The knock did not come again. In the distance, beyond the garden, she heard a voice, soft, melodic. It did not call her name this time. It simply said, "Come see." And in the clearing, one of the 11 lanterns winked out. Morning did little to ease her unease. The sun rose reluctantly, its pale light filtering through a sky choked with low gray clouds. Elias stood in the garden doorway for a long time before stepping outside, listening for birds, insects, anything living. There was nothing, not even the wind through the trees, just the occasional pop of sap inside twisted branches, and the soft crunch of gravel under her boots. She made her way toward the northern clearing with the same hesitance one might approach a sleeping animal. The lanterns came into view slowly, their dark stone shapes almost hidden in the haze. 10 remained lit. The extinguished one sat cold, its carved surface slightly darker than the others, as though something had been burned into it. She stood just beyond the circle, unwilling to enter. The cloth-draped figure at the center had changed. The sheet sagged now, its edges dragging across the earth. Something beneath it had shifted, like the shape had leaned or risen, as if taking a breath in her absence. She turned away. Back at the house, she noticed the ivy had grown thicker overnight. It now climbed past the second-story windows, twisting along the corners of the eaves like grasping fingers. Where it met the base of the garden wall, the leaves had darkened to near black, glossy and wet-looking despite the dry air. One section had curled back unnaturally, leaving a narrow gap that revealed what lay behind. Stone, worn smooth by time, and the faint impression of a door frame. She didn't look for a handle. She didn't want to know what was behind it. Instead, she spent the rest of the day in the parlor, seated in the single uncovered chair by the window. The lamp beside her flickered slightly, its oil level steady, the wick untouched. She brought the wooden box into her lap, unsure whether she intended to read more notes or simply feel the grain of its surface under her fingers. The box was heavier than before. Inside, the notes were rearranged again. New ones had joined the old. They speak in your voice now. The weeds are listening. 1 lantern will go out for each time you open the box. She read that last one twice, feeling her stomach sink. She replaced the notes and closed the lid, but the silence that followed felt heavier, as if the house itself were disappointed. That night, she did not sleep. She sat by the window, watching the garden in the moonlight. The 10 lit lanterns looked dimmer now, not flickering, just quieter, like dying embers in a hearth left unattended. She tried not to count them, but her eyes returned to the circle again and again, as if part of her already knew what she would find missing next. The second lantern winked out just past midnight. There was no sound, no breeze, just the sudden absence of light, and then a whisper at the window, low and patient. "You are still awake." She did not answer. She did not move. But her breath fogged the glass, and for a moment she saw something behind her reflection. A shape just over her shoulder. Not quite a person, not quite a shadow. When she turned, the room was empty. She returned to the bed before dawn, though she did not sleep. Instead, she lay staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint hum in the walls, a vibration, like breath, held too long. By morning, the ivy had grown through the baseboards. Tiny, delicate tendrils curling along the wood like veins. She tried, to pull one free, but it resisted with surprising strength. The moment she tugged harder, a sharp prick lanced her finger. Blood welled instantly, a single bead, dark against her skin. She backed away and left it alone. Breakfast felt like a ritual she no longer understood. She boiled water, poured it into a chipped cup, and held it without drinking. Outside, the mist clung to the garden, thickening now, gathering in the corners of her vision like static. By mid-morning, a third lantern had gone dark, and near the southern path, she saw a figure, just a flash, between trees. The same long gray dress, the same pale hair, standing perfectly still. Facing the house, Aliyah locked the door, as if that would matter. That afternoon, she heard the knock again. This time, from inside the house. Once, then silence. The box remained closed. But she knew, deep down, that the next note would be waiting anyway. The storm came without warning. It began with a shift in the air, a kind of pressure that built behind her eyes, like the stillness before a migraine. The sky darkened not with clouds, but with something heavier, more permanent, a dull bronze tone overtook the light, casting the garden in hues of tarnished metal. Aliyah stood at the window, staring at the lanterns. 7 now. The circle broken further. 3 absences that glowed darker than the flames themselves. She hadn't opened the box again, not since the last note. But she didn't have to. The words etched themselves somewhere behind her thoughts, familiar now, like a voice she no longer questioned. They no longer arrived on paper. They arrived in her dreams. When she woke that morning, the pillow was damp, the bedsheets twisted, and the mirror in the corner had fogged from within. A single phrase echoed as she stared at her reflection. "You were never alone." She could no longer recall the sound of her own voice, not the way it had been. When she tried to speak aloud, something in the tone felt off. Not wrong, but changed, hollow at the edges, like her words were passing through a chamber before they reached the air. The ivy had spread aggressively overnight, curling across the walls like veins under skin. It had split one of the upstairs doors completely down the middle. She avoided the hallway now. Her bedroom remained the only untouched space, though the lamp beside her bed had grown dim, no matter how often she trimmed the wick. She tried to write once, just to prove she could, but every time she picked up the pen, her hand hovered instead of moving, and her mind offered only one sentence, over and over: "She is almost here." It was evening again before she left the house. The garden had gone strangely silent, as though holding its breath. The path beneath her feet felt more like bone than stone, dry and brittle, and when she passed near the ivy-covered wall, it twitched just slightly, like something inside had stirred. She didn't look toward the clearing. She already knew what she'd find: another lantern extinguished. The cloth at the center of the circle had collapsed completely. Whatever had once stood beneath it was gone. The pale fabric lay flat now, soaked with earth and something darker. Still, the shape of the circle remained. 9 lanterns now, and 9 shadows, barely perceptible, hovered just at the edge of her vision, disappearing whenever she tried to count them directly. When she returned to the house, the front door was ajar, not wide, just enough. She pushed it closed and locked it, though the lock clicked without resistance, like it no longer remembered its purpose. The box on the window seat had moved again, just a few inches to the left. The note inside was no longer written in ink. It was scorched into the paper. "You will not recognize her when she arrives." That night, the knock came again. Not once, not twice, 7 times, soft and even. She did not open the door. She lay in bed, breathing shallowly, counting the seconds between knocks, even after they stopped. The lamp beside her went out mid-count, plunging the room into a dark that felt thicker than the absence of light. And then, From the hallway outside, the sound of footsteps, bare, careful, pacing. Then a voice, just outside the bedroom door. A child's voice, soft, familiar. "Why did you leave me here?" She felt her throat tighten. She did not speak, but her hand had moved without her noticing, drifting toward the doorknob. Her fingers hovered just above the brass when a soft gust of cold air swept through the room. It smelled of soil, old wood, and something else. Something human. The voice repeated itself. "Why did you leave me here?" This time, older. Not a child. Not quite her. And then came the second voice. The one that had haunted her dreams since the first night. Deeper, slower, rooted in the bones of the house. "Let her in." Elias stepped back. She whispered, "No," though even to her own ears. The words sounded strange, as if spoken through a mouth not fully her own. The door handle rattled, then fell still. Silence returned. Not peace, just pause. When dawn came, the garden had changed again. The clearing was empty. Every lantern was dark, but in the center stood a new shape. Not covered, not hidden, and this time it faced the house. Elia did not go outside. She watched the garden from her bedroom window, one hand pressed lightly against the glass. The shape at the center of the clearing had not moved. It was tall, indistinct in the morning fog, as if blurred from within. Yet something about its posture was too specific, too present. It stood with purpose, facing the house, facing her. The lanterns had not relit themselves. Without their dim flame, the garden seemed deeper, older, as though its roots had spread, past the soil and into something far beneath. The air inside the house had grown heavier, not with dust or damp, but with tension. Like the moments before a storm that never quite breaks. Downstairs, the oil lamps refused to stay lit. She tried 3 times. Each time, the flame bloomed for a second, then extinguished with a soft sigh, though there was no breeze. The ivy had crept further still, coiling along the floorboards, circling the legs of chairs, threading into the cracks between tiles. It moved quietly, but undeniably. The hallway upstairs was no longer safe. She'd heard something the night before. Not footsteps. Something softer. A brushing sound, like fingertips along old wood. Like something crawling with purpose. That morning, she made tea, or she tried. The kettle would not boil. The stove would not ignite. The pipes groaned when she ran the tap, as though struggling to remember their function. And still, the shape in the garden remained, not approaching, not retreating, watching. She no longer doubted it could see her. Late in the afternoon, the house offered her something new, a door. It was near the eastern side of the garden wall, previously hidden behind layers of ivy that had curled back, revealing a handle of blackened iron. It hadn't been there yesterday. Elias stood before it for a long time. The house was colder now. The walls no longer creaked. They breathed. A slow rhythm. In, out, in, out. The wood pulsed beneath her fingertips, barely perceptible, but present. She opened the door. The corridor behind it was narrow, lined with stone that curved inward, like the throat of a tunnel. The air smelled faintly sweet, like crushed herbs and decay. A single lantern flickered near the end of the passage, its flame steady despite the movement of air around her. She walked without thinking. The corridor ended in a small room, circular, like a forgotten root cellar. In the center stood a pedestal carved from the same pale stone as the garden lanterns. Upon it sat the wooden box, the same one from the window. She hadn't brought it there, but there it was. She approached slowly. There were no notes inside now, only a mirror, round and dark, set into the base of the box like a bowl filled with ink. When she looked into it, she did not see her reflection. She saw the clearing, but not as it was, as it had been. She saw the lanterns, 12 of them, glowing. She saw figures standing among them, not statues, people, each with eyes closed, each with lips moving soundlessly. A ritual, a remembering, and at the center stood a 13th shape, the one now waiting in her garden. Its face was not visible, but she knew it. Knew it from dreams, from voices, from the rhythm of the house. It had been here before, long before her. The mirror dimmed, and the box shut on its own behind her. The air shifted. She turned slowly. The figure from the garden stood in the doorway. It was taller than it had seemed outside. Its presence filled the room like smoke, like fog rising through floorboards. Its face remained indistinct, but its gaze was sharp, fixed. It spoke without sound, not words, not a command, an understanding. She nodded, not because she agreed, but because there was nothing else to do. When she stepped outside, the garden had changed once again. 12 lanterns burned in the clearing. The figure was gone. In its place stood Alaya, or something that looked like her. The box rested beside her feet. Inside, a new note. The house has a new caretaker. She did not remember walking back to the house. But when she sat in the chair by the window, the oil lamp flared to life again. The ivy relaxed its grip on the floor. The walls sighed. Outside, the garden exhaled in unison, and in the far distance, a child's voice whispered a single word. Next. That night, someone else received a letter, a plain envelope. No return address, just a name, an address, and a single line. The house needs a caretaker again. You are next. Story 4. The salt in the cellar. The sea had pulled away long ago. No one remembered when the tide last reached the edge of the village, though the houses still faced the shore as if expecting its return. Salt clung to the stones of every wall, crusted white and thick where the wind whipped hardest. Some said it had been generations. Others whispered it had only seemed that long. But the ships were gone. The harbor had collapsed, and what remained was a wide, flat basin of hardened sand, stretching far out until it met the distant shimmer of the new sea, barely visible on the horizon. The village itself was small and weary. Most homes were shuttered. The wooden signs above shops had peeled to the grain, and only a handful of lanterns lit the path near dusk. Moss grew in the seams of cobblestones. The wind never stopped, and beneath all of it was the salt. It came through cracks in the cellar walls, leaked from old floorboards, crept into teacups if they were left too long untouched. People claimed it was the sea's way of reminding them, or warning them. Merritt had lived there for 3 months before she noticed. She had come to the village to escape noise. The city had grown too sharp for her. She craved quiet and space and the kind of loneliness that didn't press in from all sides. When she found the listing for the stone cottage by the shore, she took it without hesitation. It was affordable, furnished, and oddly pristine for a place so forgotten. The owner lived far away and had no plans to return. He simply asked that she'll keep it in order and leave the cellar door closed. The key had been wrapped in twine and salt-stained paper. At first, the stillness felt like relief. There were no cars, no phones. The neighbors, when seen, waved politely and said little more. An older woman brought her bread once. A man from the inland farm offered fresh eggs, but they never lingered, never asked questions. Merritt filled her days with small rituals: sweeping the porch, boiling tea, walking the old coastal path that circled the basin. Sometimes she sat at the edge of the flattened sea and watched the horizon, imagining the water as it once was. She tried to picture boats returning with fish, the sound of gulls, the smell of brine and tar and wet rope. But the air was dry now, still, and the tide never came. It was 2 weeks before she ventured into the cellar. The door was heavy, its latch rusted but intact. The stairs groaned under her weight, and the air grew colder with each step, thick with a scent like stone and rust. The The cellar wasn't deep, only a few feet below ground, and yet it felt like the air had settled there for years, unmoved. She flicked on the light. Nothing. She brought a lantern the next day. Its light showed a room lined with ancient shelves, most of them empty. At the far end, tucked against the back wall, stood a single wooden table with a bowl in its center. The bowl was filled with salt. At first, she laughed. It felt like a local superstition, something quaint and forgotten. She left it alone. But she noticed that her footsteps left damp marks on the stone floor, even though the cellar was dry. And she never quite felt alone when she stood near the bowl. The following week, she noticed the salt in her bed. Just a few grains at first, scattered on the sheets like sand from a forgotten shore. Then more, gathered near the corners, rough against her skin when she shifted at night. She washed the linens. She scrubbed the floor. She searched her boots, her windowsills, her coat, but it returned. Always fine, always cold, always just enough to make her wonder. The village remained silent. The neighbors' doors were often closed now, even in the afternoon sun. A child she'd seen playing near the well was gone. The shop at the corner sold no bread that week. She asked the grocer, a man with deep lines around his eyes, if everything was all right. He simply said, "It's the tide's turn soon," and turned away before she could ask what that meant. That night, the cellar door was open. She had locked it. She was sure of it. She stood at the top of the stairs, the lantern in her hand, casting long shadows downward. The bowl was still on the table. The salt level had changed. It looked fresher now, whiter. She closed the door again and pushed a chair in front of it. She did not sleep well. The sound of something brushing against the floorboards woke her more than once. Not footsteps, not voices, just movement, like the house breathing through its foundation. The next day, she considered leaving, but she didn't. She told herself it was silly. Just an old house, creaking with time. A village filled with whispers and salt. Nothing more. And yet, when she poured water for tea, it tasted brackish. When she unpacked a loaf of bread, the crust was lined with grit. And when she went to bed that night, there was a faint dampness on her skin. Not sweat, something else, like spray, like sea mist. But the sea was gone, and outside her window, something whispered faintly in the dark. A rhythm, not a word, not quite. Just the sound of something returning, something that had waited. And beneath her feet, the cellar door creaked open again. The morning sun broke through, in thin, hesitant lines, filtered through high clouds and the distorted old glass of the cottage windows. Merritt rose stiffly, her back sore and her eyes grainy from fractured sleep. The blanket clung to her skin, damp again, as if the air itself had thickened overnight. She stripped the bed in silence. The salt was back, more of it now, nestled in the folds of the sheets, dusted along the floorboards near the bed frame. It had even crept into her wardrobe. Her black coat, which she hadn't worn since arriving, now crackled faintly when she unfolded it, the lining stiff with crystallized residue. The chair she had pushed in front of the cellar door lay on its side, not toppled carelessly, but laid down, placed. Merritt stared at the door for a long time. It was closed now, but no longer locked. The latch hung slightly loose, as though it had been twisted too hard from the inside. She didn't check the cellar again that day. Instead, she wrapped herself in a wool shawl and left the cottage early, walking the village paths without direction. The sky threatened rain, though the ground remained dry, hard as bone beneath her boots. The villagers, what few she passed, gave her wide berths. One man tipped his hat, but did not smile. A woman outside the seamstress's house watched her approach, and then turned abruptly. Stepping inside and locking the door behind her, something had changed. It wasn't just the silence, or the wary glances. It was the way the houses seemed to huddle tighter. the way the air held too still. Even the gulls, which had once circled lazily above the dried basin of the old sea, were gone. At the edge of the village stood an abandoned chapel. Merritt had noticed it before, but never entered. Its bell tower had long since collapsed, and ivy choked its narrow windows. Today, though, the door was ajar. She hesitated, then stepped inside. The air was cooler, but not fresher. It carried a musty, mineral weight. The pews were splintered, many pushed aside, and the altar had been stripped bare, except for a strange arrangement of objects at its base. She knelt before them, 7 shallow bowls, spaced evenly in a circle, each filled with water, each resting in a bed of salt. One of the bowls was broken, a jagged shard missing from its rim. The salt beneath it had been disturbed, smeared outward into a thin line pointing toward the center of the circle. There, embedded in the wooden floor, was a small metal ring. Merritt reached for it without thinking, then drew her hand back. The air above it was warmer, not from sun, not from heat. It was like standing over breath. She rose quickly and left the chapel without touching anything. That evening, the wind picked up. It moaned through the village like an old voice, speaking in a forgotten tongue. The salt in the house was thicker now, clumping along the corners of windows, forming thin lines under the doors. It gathered in her shoes, her pockets, the creases of her palms. The taste of it was constant in her mouth, no matter how much water she drank. She did not light the lantern. She sat in the dark, the fire unlit, and listened to the house. It groaned, not as timber does in weather, but deeper, slower, with intention. Then, faintly, she heard something rise beneath it, a rhythm, a slow drip, water, from the cellar. She stood, though her legs ached with cold, and made her way to the cellar door. The latch now hung open, limp against the frame. She stepped down slowly, carrying only a matchbox in her hand. At the bottom, she struck a flame. The bowl was gone. In its place, a dark wet patch marred the stone table. From the far corner, where the shelves met the wall, water was dripping, steady, deliberate, onto the floor, where it gathered in a thin, glimmering pool. The air was thick with brine. She turned to leave, but her foot slipped, the match snuffing out as she caught herself on the wall. In the dark, the scent of the sea surged, stronger now, as though the tide had somehow returned below the house. A whisper, faint and coarse, brushed against her ear. Not a word, not quite, but she understood it. It wanted to come back. Upstairs, a door slammed, not from the wind. Someone else was in the house. She didn't run. She climbed slowly, deliberately, her pulse even. She reached the door. It was closed, and from the other side, something pressed gently against it. Not pushing, not knocking, just waiting. The pressure against the cellar door ceased the moment Merritt laid her palm against it. Not with retreat, but with restraint, as if something just beyond the wood had turned its head to listen. She waited, counted to 30 under her breath, then opened the door. The hallway was empty. The fire in the hearth, long cold, flickered into life without a spark. A breath of warm air, thick with salt, rolled across her feet. The curtains, unmoved by wind, sagged as though damp. The wooden floor creaked, not under her weight, but ahead of her, as though someone had just passed by. She left the door open. Behind her, in the sitting room, the mirror above the mantel had clouded, not from dust or age, but from within, as if the reflection itself had turned away. She stepped toward it. Her face swam into view through the haze. Her mouth was closed, but the reflection's lips moved. She stepped back. Outside, the wind had stopped again. The sudden quiet rang in her ears like pressure. When she opened the front door, the entire village seemed to hold its breath. The basin was no longer dry, where the hardened sand had stretched flat for miles. Water now shimmered under a silver sky, not rising with waves, not crashing, but present, calm, reflective. A thin ocean that hadn't touched the land in decades now lapped gently at the outermost stones, and at its edge stood a figure. She couldn't make out the details, only that it was tall, motionless, and facing the house. She closed the door quietly. That evening, she did not cook. Her appetite had vanished. Instead, she boiled water and watched it go still. No steam, no movement, just warmth that seemed uncertain whether it belonged in this place. She drank nothing. She moved through the house slowly, lighting candles, though they flickered in odd patterns, as if moved by breath, rather than breeze. Then, in the attic, she found the rope. It wasn't hanging, nor was it coiled. It had been threaded neatly along the rafters, looped through old beams in a pattern that felt deliberate, measured. She traced it with her hand, following its path, as it circled once, twice, 3 times around the attic space, before ending in a knot at the far corner. There was something wrapped in the knot, cloth. She reached for it, fingers brushing coarse fabric, and pulled. A child's dress, salt-stained, threadbare, still damp. She dropped it. It hit the floor with a sound far heavier than it should have made, as though waterlogged. When she stepped back, she heard footsteps on the floor below. Not her own. The cellar. She returned to the hallway. The door was closed again, but beneath it, water pooled softly against the wood. The floor around it had begun to warp, swollen. With damp, it lifted slightly along the edges. Salt bloomed in the seams, rising like mold, brittle and white. She placed her ear to the door. No breathing, no footsteps, just the sound of water, sloshing, like a tide inside a well. She didn't open it, not then. She returned to the bedroom and found her bed unmade. She had made it that morning. The sheets were turned down. Salt glistened in the shape of a handprint on the pillow. That night, sleep refused her. She lay with the covers pulled tight, staring at the ceiling. The candle beside her burned low, its flame refusing to flicker. Hours passed in silence. And then, just before dawn, she heard it. The whisper, this time clearer. Not a word, she knew, but it came from inside the room. The candle went out. Something moved across the end of the bed. Not quickly, not forcefully. A slow, dragging pressure, as if a hand were feeling its way forward. She did not sit up. She closed her eyes. And then, faintly, she felt breath against her cheek. Moist, cold, and unmistakably human. She opened her eyes. The room was empty, but the bed beside her was damp. And on the nightstand, carved into the wood that hadn't been touched since she arrived, was a line she hadn't seen before. The tide remembers. When she rose the next morning, the mirror in the sitting room was clear again, but it showed the cottage from behind her, from outside, as though something watched from where the sea once stood. Merritt no longer left the house. She wanted to, of course. Every instinct told her to walk down the road, through the village, past the crumbling chapel, and never look back. But something in the air held her. Not physically. There were no lock, gates, no chains, no barriers. But in the hollow between thought and movement, a hesitation had taken root. Every time she reached for the doorknob, her hand fell away, as if her body already knew something her mind could not fully name. The salt was worse now. It coated the windows from the inside, blurring the view like frost. It lined the edges of every room, pushing in thin crystalline tongues across the floor. She swept it daily, but it returned by nightfall, finding its way into the folds of her clothes, beneath her fingernails, and deep into the fibers of the rugs. The sea outside had crept closer. The basin, once dry for miles, now shimmered just beyond the edge of the village, glistening under a sky that no longer changed. The air smelled not just of salt now, but of rot, wet rope, sunken wood, the long decay of things forgotten beneath the tide. At dusk, she sat by the window and watched. The figure returned, closer each night, still motionless, still watching, never crossing the stone boundary of the garden, but not remaining distant either. Its shape was indistinct, but she had begun to recognize its outline, a tall silhouette, draped in something long and water-heavy, hair or kelp or fabric trailing behind it in a faint motion that never reached the feet. Its arms hung at its sides, but she never saw it breathe. She stopped lighting candles. They burned too low, too quickly, as if something consumed them faster than the flame itself. The oil lamps sputtered. Even the fire refused to last, collapsing into smoke and embers, as if the wood were soaked. But soaked with what? She touched the logs once, before placing them in the hearth. They were dry, warm from the cupboard, and yet once the fire caught, it always died. Something about the air itself resisted warmth. That night, she heard singing, faint, rhythmic, childlike. It came from beneath the floor. She sat in the kitchen, hands wrapped around a teacup she no longer drank from, and listened. The tune was simple, repeating, wordless. It echoed softly, as though carried through a thin layer of water. She placed her ear to the floor. The boards were damp. She felt it. The steady vibration of movement below, like footsteps pacing in slow circles. Then a soft splash, then stillness. She sat back slowly. The cellar door opened, on its own, a soft creak, followed by silence. Merritt didn't move. Not at first. But something about the stillness that followed made her rise. Made her cross the threshold and stand once again at the top of the stairs. She carried no lantern. There was just enough light to see the first few steps. Salt clung to the edges like lace. She descended slowly. The air grew colder with each step, thicker, not with dust, but with pressure. When she reached the bottom, the room had changed. The table was gone. The walls wept moisture, beads of condensation dripping in steady lines down the stone. In the center of the room now stood a pool. It hadn't been there before. A perfect circle, perhaps 6 feet across. Water so dark and still, it seemed solid. Around it, salt had formed intricate patterns, swirled like tides frozen mid-motion. The air smelled of deep places, of things long submerged, and there were footprints, bare, small, leading from the water to the base of the stairs, and then back. Merritt followed them with her eyes. The water did not ripple. She turned to leave. But behind her, at the top of the stairs, stood the child. Not a vision, not a shadow, a boy. No older than 7, barefoot, his clothes wet and tattered, hair plastered against his face. His eyes were wrong, not in shape, not in color, but in depth. They reflected nothing. He stared down at her, and when she opened her mouth, no sound came. The child smiled, then stepped backward into the darkness of the hallway. Gone. She climbed the stairs quickly, heart knocking softly against her ribs. But when she reached the top, the door was open, the hallway empty, except for one thing, salt, a line of it, drawn perfectly across the floor, separating the cellar from the rest of the house. And in the center of the line, a single word etched by fingertip, soon. The word stayed there for 2 days. Merritt didn't sweep it. She didn't cross it. Each time she passed the hallway, she moved quietly, holding her breath, unwilling to disturb the line of salt or the message drawn into its center. Soon, it no longer felt like a warning. It felt like a promise, one the house meant to keep. She no longer slept in the bedroom. The bed had become unusable. Dampness clung to the mattress, and the walls wept brine that ran in thin streaks toward the floor. The mirror on the dresser showed not her reflection, but the house from above, as if someone else, something else, was watching her from the ceiling beams. She caught glimpses of herself within it, only as she moved. Never directly, never completely. Instead, she slept in the sitting room, or tried to. She would doze in the old armchair, wrapped in a heavy coat, listening to the rhythm of water dripping somewhere below. Sometimes it stopped. Those were the worst nights. When the sound ceased entirely, the silence became a presence, like something standing still in the dark, just behind her shoulder. On the third day, she found the bowl again. It had returned to the cellar, but not to the table. It now sat at the center of the pool, floating gently atop the dark water, perfectly still, despite no visible support. Salt circled the bowl in a shifting pattern, as though the water were moving beneath it. Inside the bowl was the child's dress, still damp, still folded. This time, she picked it up, and from beneath it, a voice rose, not from the air, but from inside her head. A memory that wasn't hers. A flash of stone corridors and lanterns held low, of others standing in a circle, chanting, dropping salt into a bowl as water seeped through cracks in the walls. Of something beneath them, something old, patient, and listening. The house was never meant to be a home. It was meant to be a lid, a seal, and someone, sometime, had stopped tending it. The salt had stopped being renewed. The circles had broken, and the sea, which had receded by force and ritual, had begun its return. That night, the boy came again. This time, inside the house. She woke to the sound of water running, not dripping, not pooling, but running steadily, as though through pipes that had not been used in years. She followed the sound barefoot, careful not to break the salt lines still etched in the hallway. The boy stood at the kitchen sink, his back to her. He was humming now, a slow tune, familiar, not because she had heard it before, but because it was in the walls now, in the pipes, in the foundation, the rhythm of the tide. When he turned, his face had changed, not grotesquely, not in some violent, monstrous way, but subtly. His mouth no longer moved when he spoke, and his eyes had deepened into pools that held no bottom. "Come," he said, not aloud, not to her ears, but to something within her, and she followed. Back through the hallway, back past the untouched salt line, back down into the cellar. The water was higher now. The pool had expanded, reaching the base of the stairs. It lapped gently at the stone, whispering against each step like a greeting. The bowl still floated, but the dress was gone. In its place was a stone, smooth, round, damp with seawater. She reached for it, and when her fingers closed around it, the house exhaled. All at once, she understood. The village had not been abandoned. It had been given, one house at a time. Each family, each person, part of the balance, the cost of keeping the tide back. They had lived beside the sea, not to escape it, but to hold it back with salt, and memory, and silence. And now it was her turn. She was the last, the only name on the lease, the final one to turn the key. She sank to her knees, the cold reaching her bones, and placed the stone in the bowl. The cellar lit with a faint glow. The salt on the walls flared white, and the water stilled. The boy stepped into the pool, his form dissolving into light as he sank, not drowning, not struggling, just returning. The sea accepted him, and then receded. By morning, the pool was gone. The salt was dry. The house was silent. Outside, the tide had pulled back once more, further than before, leaving behind cracked stone and pale sand. The basin returned to its long silence. The sky was clear. Merritt made tea. She swept the hallway. She watched the edge of the sea from her window. She did not leave. She could not. There was always someone who stayed. And when the bowl filled again, when the salt began to drift in little curls beneath the floor, she would be there, to listen, to wait, to remember. The tide forgets nothing.